Almost a month has passed since the terrorist attack on Kakhovskaya HPP, which was carried out by Russians. Other countries have already seen the consequences. For example, in Abkhazia, corpses of dead pigs washed up on the shore. And this is a visual demonstration of the consequences of blowing up the Kakhovskaya HPP by Russians. The truth is that destroying the dam, the occupiers destroyed the normal access of water to the cooler at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And the worst thing is that the nuclear power plant was additionally mined. And the worst is that the cooler was mined. If they disable it, there is good chance there will be significant problems. We, Ukrainians, like Russians, have already experienced a terrible tragedy, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which, by the way, was also committed by Russians. But we, Ukrainians, like most of the world, except the occupiers, of course, remember the consequences of the spread of radiation. Currently, Russia has completed preparation for blowing up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And according to the head of the Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence, Kirill Budanov, the plan of the terrorist attack has already been approved. The only thing missing is the order to carry it out. And currently, there is information that occupiers suggested to the troops and people who became to the site evacuate themselves from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant till July 5th. Russia is using the nuclear power plant as a tool of nuclear blackmailing. And today, Russia has the motivation and means to commit an incident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And of course, there will be the huge and terrible consequences of a possible accident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The terrorist attack on this nuclear power plant will affect the lives of approximately 1 billion people in 40 countries. The exclusion zone can be 30,000 square kilometers, and the contaminated territory is 2 billion square kilometers. This is almost all of Ukraine. And the pollution will take over Turkey, Belarus, Moldova, Romania, and even swarm itself on Moscow. The IAEA agency doesn't confirm the mining of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant cooling pond, but states that the plant is mined around the perimeter and in some places inside. And of course, it's mined by Russians, because almost a year, the power plant still occupied by Russians. But actually, we already know that this agency, IAEA agency, is really useless formation, and actually, I would rather believe our intelligence. In addition, the occupiers can create a man-made disaster in Crimea. In the Crimean Armyansk city, the Russians are preparing a terrorist attack on the Crimean Titan chemical plant. If an explosion happens there, it will be an artificial man-made disaster. If the occupiers blow up the Crimea Titan plant, Ukraine, Turkey, Romania, Moldova will fall into the zone of destruction. Currently, Ukraine is monitoring the situation and activity of Russian occupiers on the territory of the enterprise, and record cases of partial departure of the local population due to fears of a disaster. You need to know what's happening at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because foreign authorities don't seem to be taken seriously. Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Dnipro regions have started drills in case of an accident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The exercises account as close of real-life events as possible, practicing every possible scenario. For example, if a radioactive cloud reached any region in Ukraine depending on the wind that day. Evacuation teams are also working in each locality to move people into safe zones. Obviously, in those places that are not occupied, almost 200 additional police patrols are working on the highways to make sure that there are not any traffic jams and so that the evacuation vehicles can move freely. And a little while ago, John Kirby said that he doesn't see imminent danger at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will. But he doesn't mean they are going to blow it up tomorrow, or he might not think they are going to do it on purpose. But as my opinion, I think that it's not likely that they are going to blow it up on purpose. But the entire territory of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe is mined. The cooling pond is mined. 4 out of 6 reactors are mined. So a situation with human negligence, where all of their personnel isn't being rotated as they should be. They're not seeing their families. They're being threatened. They're exhausted. They are in a constant state of stress. They can make a mistake, a very costly mistake, and for that reason. And we should be prepared. For example, buy some necessary, of course in this case, medicals to decrease radiation effect. And this is just in case, because better safe than sorry. And of course, don't take these medical pills unless exposed to radiation. And of course, you should consult your doctor. Parliamentary Assembly of European Union adopted a resolution on political consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And we will talk about some points, in particular parliamentary supported. Peace plan of Ukrainian President Zelensky. Continuation and strengthening of additional civil and military aid. Expansion of the list of individuals and legal entities subject to sanctions in the Russian Federation, Belarus and third countries. Creation of a public register of companies and persons who work for the benefit of Russian Federation interest, for example, help to avoid sanctions. Recognition of the Wagner private mercenary campaign and other paramilitary formations participating in the invasion of the Russian Federation as terrorist groups. Recognition of the regime of the Russian Terrorist Federation as following the ideology of Russism. Recognition of the Russian Federation as guilty of ecocide, which took place due to the undermining of the Kakhovskaya HPP in order to stop Ukraine's counteroffensive. Also, Assembly recognizes Russia's intention to blow up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And there is another surprise for Russian terrorists. China, Russia's hoped-for friend, is disillusioned with Russia and a weak Putin, and now sees the Russian Federation as a commodity appendage. China isn't against Ukraine's exit to the borders of 1991. And now, about the most critical situation in the history of modern Russia, and the disclosure of the truth about Putin. Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former thug cook, is the former head of the Wagner private military campaign, which consists of bloodthirsty mercenaries and prisoners. The Wagners were very cruel, without principles, and were well armed. They create a lot of trouble for our Ukrainian army on the front line. But having accumulated weapons, Prigozhin and Wagners decided to go to Moscow. Of course, it was a circus, an internal showdown between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner mercenaries. Apparently, Prigozhin wanted to become Minister of Defense and then in 2024 to run instead of Putin, especially since Prigozhin has better media coverage and he could easily get attention among the bonded slaves of Russians. From 8 to 25,000, as Russians said, Wagner mercenaries left the territory of Ukraine and really went towards Moscow. The Russian city of Rostov was taken by Wagner mercenaries without a fight. Captured the headquarters of the Southern Military District, the building of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Then they went to Voronezh city and were on the outskirts of Krasnodar and Volgograd cities. Everyone in Moscow was really so scared. Putin didn't even contact Prigozhin to settle the rebellion, but fled with his plane with a red bottom towards to the bunker. His close associates immediately went by plane with the families to Turkey, Emirates. Who goes where? In Moscow, Russians began to dig trenches and set up checkpoints. But Wagner mercenaries stopped 200 kilometers from Moscow. Apparently, overestimate their strength, and actually all these events were in less than 2 days. Do you feel that difference? At the beginning, in 2022, Russians said, "We will take Kyiv in 3 days." And what now? In 2023, Russians said, "We must save Moscow." From the Russian mercenaries, actually. But the most interesting thing is turned out that Putin is an old, decrepit senile who crap all his pants. What kind of a great ruler or leader is this that Russia propaganda makes of Putin, who can't resolve such a conflict with his own courtier? Instead, Putin sends his mud the potato Führer, the self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Lukashenko, in his place. As reported, it was Lukashenko who persuaded Prigozhin to stop. According to available information, Prigozhin was promised to fire the Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia, and in turn, Prigozhin flies to Belarus. Of course, Prigozhin was taken away to Belarus, but Shoigu wasn't fired. Moreover, Putin decided that he didn't look pathetic enough and decided to make a couple of speeches, mumbling under his breath something about suppressing this rebellion. But here is what's even more interesting. At first, Putin stated that Wagner mercenaries had nothing to do with the Minister of Defense and Russia itself, and now, after this coup, Putin himself said that Wagner was fully funded from the Russian state budget and the Minister of Defense. Accordingly, it turns out that Russia paid for this coup itself. As Putin said, in a year they gave 860 billion rubles for the maintenance of Wagners. And now a question for Russian pensioners. How do you live in ruined houses and with a pension of several thousand rubles per month? Of course, the Ukrainians didn't hope for this coup, but it was funny. But here is what the world really took away from this situation. Putin is weak and humiliated, no longer in authority, and doesn't control the situation even in his own country. The Russians are ready to support even the thugs Wagner, but not Putin. The defense of the territory of Russia is weak. The myth about the unity of Putin's Russia is over. And people. When Wagner entered Rostov, the inhabitants of the city shouted, "Why are you not going to Moscow? Why are you come to Rostov?" And when grief happens in the Ukraine city, everyone from other cities in Ukraine will rally to help our people. When Russian tanks entered Ukraine in the first days of the war, people stopped these tanks with their bare hands. Here is the difference. The Russians and Ukrainians are not fraternal people. We are not the same people. Forget this lie imposed by the Russians. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia has increased the production of caliber missiles and X-101 missiles by 3-4 times. Russians produce approximately 40-30 missiles, depending on the type. Missiles type Kinjal, or by English is daggers, LS of course, up to 6 units per month. The level of production now is even a little more than it was before the large-scale war. The enemy used a large number of missiles from its arsenal from October to January, and in March-April of this year, the occupiers accumulated their reserves, resumed production in most positions, changed or even improved the tactics of using both missiles, weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles. According to the German publication Bild, the Russian Federation launched a surprise offensive on Lugansk frontline. Russian forces are advancing from near Kremenaya to Liman and from near Svatovo to Kupiansk. In Ukraine, it is also noted that the Russians really went on the offensive near Kupiansk. There are heavy battles. But the Ukrainian army has certain advances in all directions where our military is moving. There are heavy battles. We gnaw out every meter of land from the enemy. But the main blow is yet to come. For the first time, the Ukrainian armed forces liberated the territory held by the Russians since 2014. The enemy is mining fields, and there is also information that in the Zaporizhzhia region, the enemy is mining every settlement where people live, without warning them. Russia continued to roar with shelling. On the night of June 22, terrorists fired Kinjal missiles, which were directed at the dam in Kryvyi Rih. However, the missiles didn't hit the targets, thanks to our air defense. On the night of June 24, Russia fired missiles type of X-21 and 555 at Kyiv. Air defense forces destroyed more than 20 missiles in the capital's airspace. But the crushed debris fell into the apartment building. And don't think that these debris can't do anything. Just look at the photo, at these pictures. This is the consequences. And 11 people were injured, 3 died, 24 were arrested. On June 28, Russia hit Kramatorsk. with 2 Iskander missiles. Kramatorsk is a city, is part of the Donbas zone, Donbas region. Let me remind you that the occupiers came to Ukraine by war under the pretext of liberating Donbas. And now Russians themselves kill civilians of Donbas region. Those 2 rockets, Iskander missiles, hit cafe where people were eating and residential buildings. 12 dead and 61 wounded as a result of the Russian attack on Kramatorsk. Among the killed are children. And for the last news for today, I would like to remind and confirm that Russia is a country of dung and scum. Everything you need to know about Russian justice. Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner mercenaries, when they rebelled, killed 12 Russian pilots and shot down their helicopters. And the criminal case against Prigozhin was closed. And here is a photo of Russians who were jailed for burning a banner with the letter Z, for criticizing the war against Ukraine. Someone was jailed for 2 posts on the internet against the war, for a theatrical performance, someone for a note on the grave of Putin's parents. This woman written that Putin's parents raised a bad son. And, for example, the artist was jailed for yellow-blue paint on the wall of the city hall in temporarily occupied Crimea. This is what Russian justice is like. And on the federal channel, federal television, the main propagandist, this woman, who actually likes to eat beaver's meat, as she said, this woman says that legal norms can be ignored. They are not tabooed. She stated that legal norms are not the commandment of Christ and not the tablets of Moses. I can't understand what happened on these Moscovia swamps. This was the main news for last week's. Thank you for staying with us on Yakovlev channel. Subscribe, share our video and stay safe. Glory to Ukraine! Slava Ukraini!